Hi, and welcome to this deep dive into PowerPivot with SQL Server 2012. My name is Julie Strauss. I'm a Senior Program Manager on the Analysis Services team. The agenda for today is to provide a deep dive, as the title says, into the new features that will be available with PowerPivot SQL Server 2012. And the best way to do that is really to walk you through lots of demos to try and highlight as many of the new features as I can. So before we go there, I have a couple of slides that I would like to walk you through, and then we'll go into the demos. The first area I would like to talk about is the BI semantic model. As you may have heard from other sessions, is that with this release of SQL Server 2012, we are introducing what we call the BI semantic model, or the Microsoft BI semantic model. So there's a few different angles you can look at this. So first of all, we are thinking of one semantic model across BI for Microsoft. So in previous releases, you may know that we had a model for reporting, another one for analysis, and for scorecards. With this release of SQL Server, we are consolidating on a single semantic model, which is owned by the Analysis Services team. So whether you do reporting or analysis, you will be using the BI semantic model. Also, for different type of users, that means one model. So whether you do personal BI or team BI or organizational BI, that is all the one and same model that you will be building and working with. The last angle is really how this one model is experienced by client tools. So let's say you're working in Excel. As an end user connecting to the BI semantic model, no matter how it's built, whether you have a tabular project type or a multi-dimensional project type, the new tabular type being the new project type that will be available with this release, the experience that the end user have in interacting with this model, it will be experienced as one model. They won't really know the difference between the two way it's built. But for you as a developer or a person developing the model, you will have two different ways of building it. Tabular, meaning with tables and relationships, and the multidimensional project type that you know from the OLAP cubes that we have shipped with previous releases. So regardless of how it's built, for the end users, it will always be experienced as one semantic model. Talking a little bit about the investment areas for the Analysis Services team, we can split the work we've done for this release into three different product areas. Our main focus for this release really was to offer a professional tool set for building tabular project types. So essentially what this meant was taking the technologies that some of you may be familiar with from PowerPivot that we introduced in the previous release, and make that available for professionals inside Visual Studio. So that was really the core focus of the team. But since we have a shared code base between PowerPivot and the professional tool set, you will see a wealth of new features that have been added to PowerPivot as well, since they surface in both tools. And that's really the focus of this presentation today. What this also means is that all of the features that I'll be showing you, even if they're using PowerPivot, you will also see in the professional tool set inside Visual Studio, inside the data tools. And finally, the last focus area was Management Studio, where, as you know from previous releases, when you're working with OLAP cubes, you would see dimensions and measure groups. But for this, when you're working with tabular project type, we've updated the Management Studio so you would see tables instead of dimensions and measure groups. So those are really the core investments for the release. Again, the focus for this presentation moving forward is really all the new modeling features, and here shown inside V2 of PowerPivot. With that, let's move into the demos. Actually, one more slide that I would like to do before I go to the demos. So let's go one back. And that is what I think of as the transition of the semantic model across the BI spectrum. And it's really a core thing to have in mind as well. when developing the BI semantic model. So what we basically say here is that you can start in one end of the spectrum and seamlessly navigate and move your solution across to Team BI and Corporate BI. So for example, you can have an Excel power user start out building a PowerPivot solution using the PowerPivot add-in for Excel. Now that lives on your desktop as personal BI. You can now take that using the PowerPivot for SharePoint add-in, upload that to SharePoint, and share this solution with your team. So not only does this solution now become available for your team, but it also becomes available for IT, who can now manage this solution, make sure it's secure and it's backed up. You can enable automatic data refresh, etc. So really taking this into the area of managed self-service BI. And that was also what we provided with the first release of PowerPivot. And now with this new release of SQL Server 2012, we are adding that final piece into allowing you to move this solution into corporate BI as well, which basically means that any of the models that you have built using PowerPivot in Excel, you can now import directly into the data tools of sitting inside Visual Studio. You can point to that Excel file and basically extract that model that you already built in Excel and keep developing on that model. So essentially you can take a model created by an Excel user, they can hand it over to you, and you can import it into Visual Studio, where you now get the entire model right there. No migration or anything like that. All you do is point to the file and upload it, and you will now have the whole project available for you to continue developing, and now you can deploy that to a tabular project type or server running on the server. In the same way, you can take this workbook if you don't necessarily need to add any additional features, if you don't need to extend the modeling capabilities, you can restore this embedded workbook file directly in Management Studio and restore it to Analysis Services servers, where it will now be deployed. So in essence, you can take a workbook started in Excel and move that across the BI spectrum and take it into a corporate BI solution deployed to a server without having to rebuild anything. You don't have to start from scratch. So with that, now let's move into the demos. So I'll go out here in Excel. And for those of you who may be new to PowerPivot, let me just point out here that PowerPivot is an add-in to Excel 2010. It's a separate add-in here where we'll be doing all our data mashup. So first thing I want to do is launch the PowerPivot window, which you will see here. So PowerPivot is essentially a separate window that lives on top of Excel, where I'll do all my data mashup. You can see here I've already imported some tables just to get started. We have added a few new features during the import experience, but nothing that I'll be highlighting here. It's more for we have some extended date filtering and extended text filtering in there. So in here you see I have imported quite a few tables. I am, for this demonstration, I'm working with a sales data warehouse for a soft drink company. So you see here I have different tea and juice drinks, carbonated drinks, sparkling water, apple juice, etc. So all these data is basically coming from one source. And again, for those of you who are new to PowerPivot, I just want to point out that mashing up data from different sources really is one of the core features and benefits of PowerPivot, making it very simple for you to get the data in here. So the idea is that the end user doesn't necessarily have to know how to write SQL queries, but we allow you to essentially filter what looks like Excel tables, and which then behind the scenes we will actually write the SQL queries on behalf of the user. So taking all the complexity out of mashing data up and getting them from structured data sources. So with that very simple setup here, have tables from one single source, multiple tables, and now I could go do my analysis. Before I do that, I want to talk about the first feature that I'll be introducing, which is probably the number one most frequently requested feature that we have from the first release of PowerPivot, which is the diagram view. So the diagram view essentially is a metadata view of the model. In the first release of PowerPivot, we had the data-driven view where you can always see all the data that you're working with. Each table is represented in a separate sheet. But a lot of the feedback we got was, especially for the more experienced BI users, was that you would really like to see a schematic view of the model, because what you're building is a model. So here you see all the tables laid out and more essentially all the relationships between them. So we had the options of either just kind of doing an image, linking, giving you a view of how all the objects are related. We did decide to go all the way though and basically offer a fully fledged designer. So this is a full-blown designer. We worked very hard to try and keep the two views on par in terms of features. So instead of forcing you to switch back and forth the two views, depending on your preference for view, data view or diagram view, you can more or less stay in the same view the most of the time that you are developing your model. There are a few exceptions though, because there are some operations that lend themselves better to a data-driven view and others to a metadata-driven view. So for example, calculations, creating meshes, creating calculated fields and calculated columns is all done in the data-driven view, because this is where you can actually validate the calculations you're building. Also, features like sorting, we have enabled only in the data-driven view because they're not really useful in the metadata view where you don't see the data. At the same way, there are some features that lends itself better to the metadata-driven view. An example of this would be a user-defined hierarchies, which is what we will be taking a look at a little bit later on. But more or less, you have feature parity with calculations and hierarchies as the exceptions. So to prove this, let's start by adding some more data. So I've imported data from SQL. What I wanted to do now is mash this up with some desktop data. So I said before, I have all the data from a sales data warehouse in here. What I would like to compare myself to industry trends. So industry trends basically representing how other soft drink companies are doing in the industry. So you see I have copy-pasted some data here from the internet. It could be data that I've purchased as well. This time I've downloaded it. You see the different categories that I also sell across and the different territories. So this is all US data. So I can just copy, highlight the table, say copy, and now that I have data on my clipboard, I have the paste control enabled. So I'll go ahead and just paste this. And you'll see here data preview of the data that I have in my clipboard, simple, so I can validate that I've done the right selection. And I'll call this industry trends. There you go. And paste this in. And again, for those of you who have been using the first version of PowerPivot, this will all be familiar to you, but you would just be doing this in the data view instead. So what happens when you work in the diagram view, we will add all newly added tables to the far right to just keep them out. You can easily identify what you have added, and they're also selected by default. So another interesting thing is you go back into the data view, obviously the table sits here, right? But it's really hard. It just looks like any other table, and I don't really see the connections between them. When I'm in the diagram view, it's very easy for me to see all of the tables have relationships between them, with exception of this one table that I've added. So that obviously will force me here to give me an idea that I have to go and create a relationship. We still have the automatic detection that we support in the pivot table, but here, since I am in diagram view, I want to use my relationship diagram here to create a relationship. There's multiple ways I can do it. I can either right-click the column, and I'll say now create a relationship. And now, for those of you who have been using the previous release, you'll see this is the exact same dialog that I will get if I right-click a column, this particular column, in the data view. Because it is the same code, it's just a different view. I don't want to do that, though. I can be a little bit more fancy here in the diagram view because it is a graphical designer. So I can actually go here, select the column, and do drag and drop. You see when I'm out here, I can't drop it. You'll see the cursor change. And as soon as I'm in here, I will drop it over that alternate key and basically create the relationship for me. So there you go. If I zoom out a little bit, now you can see that everything is connected. Right? And again, you can see the interactivity. It will highlight the endpoints for me when I select the relationship. Will obviously count for any relationship in here. So first of all, you see the highlight of the table endpoints when I just mouse over the relationship, and also the endpoints in there, making it very easy for me to identify what I have in here. So with that, with the data pasted, next thing I want to go and do is obviously analyze this data and see how my cells are doing according to industry trends. First thing you'll see, I have a refresh notification here because I've added more data in here. I've added a new table, so that metadata should show up in here as soon as I click refresh. So there's my newly added table. So let me start by adding, so for example, product category. And let me go to product subcategory table and add a product subcategory. I will go and add sales amount, use the search, there's sales amount. There you go. That was pretty easy, 3 clicks, and I have built the first basic pivot table where I can see each of my categories and subcategories and how the sales are doing. That's easy so far. Let me just clear the search. And now I would like to mash this up with the unstructured data that came from my desktop, the copy-pasted data, and I will add industry trends. There you go. That was how easy it was to mash up this data. What you will see, though, here, these data are actually formatted. So the sales amount are formatted. The industry trends, or the industry sales, are not. So why is this? Well, another new feature that we added is the ability to persist the formatting. So instead of you having to format every time you add a field to the pivot table, have to use the Excel pivot formatting out here, we will actually allow you to format in the model so you can reuse that. So if I go back into the PowerPivot window, if I go back here and look at my retail sales, I will see here that my sales amount is formatted, which is why I get that formatting. But if I go to my industry trends, which I copy pasted from Word, I didn't format that. So if I go out now and format this as dollars, I will just remove the decimals. And now if I go back into Excel, you'll see I have another notification stating that my data changed. So I can now choose to refresh, and voila, now that is formatted as well. So this may not seem like a lot, but if you have a lot of users working with this model, you're really saving a lot of users the time for having to format every single time that they add a new field to every single pivot table. And obviously the users can overwrite this if they want to, and change that as they see fit. So with that, we'll come back to this data a little bit later on, but let me just go and add some slices as well. Another change, you'll see that the field list is now sorted alphabetically, which is a new change. So we are more closely following what Excel is doing in the native field list of Excel. Let me go and add some slices. So I will add month name and fiscal year. There you go. And we can just narrow this a little bit. So what you see here is slices based on visual filters that will allow you to lay out on the surface. enabling you to build more what looks like a solution. So now you see here the slices, they actually happen to be sorted alphabetically. Very often that is what you want. In this case it's not, because I want it to be sorted naturally, meaning January, February, March. There's no easy way to do that directly here on the Excel side, so we have added a new capability inside the modeling window, because it's basically a property I set on my columns, where I can say I can take this month field and I can sort this. We have added a control called sort by other column. Now it's pre-selected the column that I was in, so it inherits the context. Say the month column, sort the month column by the month number, if I could find it, and say OK. So nothing has really happened yet, but if I now sort this, it will say January, February, because it sorts this column by this column. Okay. Now, if I go back into Excel side, voila, and automatically as I refresh, it will sort this naturally. This is just a very common scenario for it, where you're sorting month name naturally, but there are other areas where it's super useful. For example, if you look at product categories and you want either your newest product line on top, or the best performing, whatever, the logic you can think of that for how you want to sort the slices in here. So there can be a lot of use areas for this feature, other than just month sorting. Okay, so let's go back into the pivot table. So here, when you saw, I have now here sales amount as well as the industry sales. So this is basically how my company doing compared to competition. So another metric for this is really, this is my market share, right? So I want to see how I'm doing according to industry trends over time. So it's a metric I would like to continue tracking. So very ideal for creating a key performance indicator, a KPI, that I want to store as part of my model. So to do this, I will go and find my sales amount. Let me just find here. I'll find my sales amount again. What you will realize, which can be a little bit tricky, the way to activate the Create KPI UI is really to select. It's selected in context of your field list. So you have to find, or have to create, an explicit measure. You see it has a little calculator here, meaning that I have explicitly gone and created a formula for sales amount, which I do out here, and we'll get to the measure grid in a second as well. So you have to select a measure. I can either now open it up here as long as it's selected in the field list, or I can right-click the measure and select Create KPI. So this opens up the KPI UI. Here, it inherits the measure, the calculation that I've already done. So it will actually enrich this measure with more KPI-ness, not really a word, but it fits in here. And in addition to that, I need a target measure. And now it tells me that no measures have been defined. So let me go back in here, which actually gives me another opportunity to show you more formatting options. So I can go in here to industry trends. I can say add a new measure there, or new measure here. And I can call this industry sales, just to give it another name. It's really the same as industry trends. So I'll call sum, and I will find the industry sales amount that I had from before. And here you also see the new formatting options that we have for measure creation, which we did not have in previous release either, or we didn't persist it. So I can just add currency as well, 0 decimals, and say OK. It already exists. And let me remove the space, industry sales. And now it added that one. It can only have one measure with that name. So I can now remove the implicit measure that I created by adding the column to use this explicit sale measure that I have here. So now let me go back and find sales amount and create a KPI. And what you'll see now is the warning went away, and I have one measure, obviously, and I'm fully useful model. You have a lot more measures than what I've defined here. I only have the single one. Another one, if I create, for example, like I here create a KPI based on a measure, which basically means that my calculation constantly changes depending on what I have on my field list or in my pivot table. So absolute value is a constant. So let's say I was tracking the number of hours that employees work per week, for example. That will never change in context of the pivot table. I always want employees to work 9 hours, so it never changes. That's a constant. But here, in this case, I do want, because I want to change the measure depending on how the industry sales change and how the pivot table change. So I've selected my input measure. Here I can define the thresholds, which I can either slide in here or I can type it directly in there. I'll get back to that in a second. I also have here, I say green is good and green is better here. I can turn that around and switch the color scheme. I can say closer to target is better. So if I'm working on, let's say, machine park utilization, it's not really too high or too low. It's not really good. You need to be closer to target is better. And here I can revert that color scheme. In addition, I can change the icons. This is just a preview of the icon set that will be used when adding the KPI on the Excel side. I can also change the granularity. Here I have 5 ranges and different colors, and I'll go back to my 3 range, and I'll say if my sales are below 50%, then it's red. I'm apparently a pretty aggressive competitor, and let's say still 80 is fine. If I am above 80, that's good. Target is still up here. It doesn't mean that I have to go all the way to the target. My target could be 100%, but above 80 could still be good enough. Okay, so I've defined that, and I'll say okay. And now automatically it will go ahead and transform what was before measure with the little calculator into a KPI. So I've added more context to this calculation, which is now KPI. So what was before the sales amount is now this value field, right? So it hasn't really changed. It hasn't changed that measure. If I used it as input to other calculations, all of that will continue to work. And if I now don't want the KPI anymore, I have 2 options. I can delete the KPI, which will basically remove that KPI-ness, or I can delete both the KPI and the base measure, which will delete this entire object from the model. So I can kind of downgrade it again in case I regretted what I did. Okay, so with that, now this is actually stored as part of my model, making it very easy for all other users to use the same metric without having to redefine everything on their own. Another thing that we have added is description. So here I see green and red and yellow, but what does it mean? I know what it means because I created the KPI. I know this is above 80, right? And I know that green is good. But another user using this may not know that unless they actually open the dialog, which is not really all that convenient. So what I can do as well is add description. So I can add here KPI description, and I can say this is my market share KPI, and I can say above 80 is good, less than 50 is bad. When I can say status, I can say green is good, red is bad. Okay, and I can obviously fill all of these, and I can say okay. Now ideally you would want to be able to see that as you mouse over the icons. Over here we don't really control that, so we will have to work with Excel on that. But we do control the field list, so when you mouse over each of these fields in the field list, you will see this. Excuse me. So when you mouse over KPI here, you will see the text that I wrote there, and for the status, you'll see green is good and red is bad. It's not just for the KPIs. We also added descriptions to the measures. So I go here and edit the formula. You will see here's my description, right? If I say OK now, and you will see that description in here as well. Inside the modeling window, we added descriptions for columns, which will just give you a plain text box, and as well to tables, there's descriptions. So to all the most commonly used objects that will surface in the field list, we have added descriptions. And again, to have in mind here is that it is up for the client tools to decide whether these are exposed or not. So if you use the regular Excel pivot table or field list to connect to a tabular model stored or hosted on a server, you won't actually see these tooltips because the native pivot table doesn't support it. But you may have other reporting tools that does support annotations, which we have in OLAP cubes as well. So it really depends. It's up for the client tools to determine whether these will show or not. So that was descriptions. So let's move on to the next area, which is measure creation. So a very common scenario we saw with the more novice users of PowerPivot is they would run into a little bit of a challenge when it comes to creation of measures, calculated fields. Because let's say you have, let's go into reseller sales, for example. You have here sales amount and you have product cost. Very natural calculation for me to create is profit, right? I'll take my sales amount minus the cost and I have my profit. The more natural way to do that for an Excel user is either to create the calculation out here, which really means it only lives in this pivot table, so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you're talking about working with a model. We'll go in here and you'll take the one column, meaning sales amount, minus the cost column. That doesn't really work either because a measure is multidimensional concept, so I need the sum of one column minus the sum of another. So I need one measure minus another measure. And that's a concept that's really hard to convey in this dialog. So what we did for this release was add the ability to create calculations or measures inside the PowerPivot window. So let me go back in here and find retail sales. What I can enable here is what we call the calculation area. So here you will actually see the measure of the KPI that I created before. So what we went out and sat to very novice users saying, if you needed to create a calculation saying sum of sales, how would you do that? And obviously they described the way you do in Excel, where you have auto sum. So if I click auto sum, you will see a sum down here. So let me just create auto sum there. So now I'll get sum of sales amount. What we're doing here is taking sum of. We have others, so I used sum. We also have average count, distinct count, min and max. So we have sum, which is the first part of the name, and then we just inherit the name of the column, and then we add a DAX calculation. So there you go. I didn't really have to know the syntax for this. We added a shortcut allowing you to create the very most basic DAX calculations. I can also obviously multi-select in here and say auto sum, and it will create sum of all of these columns. So now I have very quickly in one click created 4 explicit measures. What I could do now is obviously hide the columns because I no longer need these in the field list, because these will show up as explicit objects in the field list. So go back to the profit example. The way the user now would do this is say, here I have my one column and my other column. Now I can go in here where it makes much more sense and say, I'll insert a column. This is just one way you can do it. I will insert a column. There you go. And I'll say equal the sum of sales amount minus the column of product cost. And I'll say OK. And I will call this my profit. Okay? So this is my profit column. Now it's very easy for me to say sum of this column, and this is my measure for sum of profit. Let me just do this, sum of profit, rename it, And that's very easy. Another way I could do this was just say, because as I said before, it could be one measure minus another measure. I can go down here, say equal, and now because this is a free-form grid, we also support a semi-select, and I can just go and select this measure minus the cost measure, and now it will create the measure for me here. So what happened here is now I have something called measure 1. Why? Because I just started writing an equal sign. I'm not inheriting anything from any columns, but I do need a name because this is what shows in the field list. So now I can call this my profit. Okay? Now that's my profit. Now it will change the name. So everything to the left of the colon is the name. If I remove the colon, I will actually turn this into text. Now it's just a string, and you will see I'll get a warning, do you want to convert this into string? I don't want to do that. If I had in fact done that, it would show in italic because it's no longer a measure. So this is a string, meaning it won't really show in the field list. It's just for me to make notes and whatever I want to do. And obviously I can add formatting to this measure as well. So what's up with the location of these? The location, and what is the meaning of the location? It really means nothing. The location means what you put into it. So you determine what effect the location has. So I can take this one, Control X, cut it out, and paste it in here. The formula doesn't change or anything. It's a free-form grid. I could take this one as well, sum of extended sales amount, and move it onto here. It doesn't really matter. Nothing changes. I can arrange these anywhere I want, and I am the one responsible for putting meaning into the location if I want that at all. As a professional BI practitioner, you're likely going to line everything up here in the column to the left. That's what makes sense for a lot of users that are used to professionally developing BI solutions. But for a lot of Excel users, it really makes more sense to have it in context of the columns. And more specifically, it really helped bridge the gap between working with measures and sum of and working with columns to get the right context out. So that is the measure grid. Or the calculation area. The calculation area is enabled by default for all tables, so you can go in and disable them if you don't need it, because typically you need it for your fact table, so sales, for sales tables, etc. Don't necessarily need them for product tables. They can obviously sit there. Another feature that we support now is copy. Control C, paste it in, which was another very highly requested feature we got. If you have some complex calculations you want to copy, before you had to copy from the formula bar, now you can do it directly in here. So that's also very useful. With that, let me just move into, go back into the diagram. Oh, one other thing that actually I would like to highlight is distinct count. Let's say here I have, for example, unit price. If I do count of unit price, let me just make this grid a little bigger. Now you see the count of unit price is really the same as the number of rows I have in the table, because it's counting all the entrants that I have here. But let's say I want to go here and I want to do distinct count. Now it will go and do a count all the unique values that I have in here. So now what I have here is distinct count, where I will know that I have 40 distinct prices in here, 42 different unit prices in here. So very, very quick way of doing a well-performing distinct count in here. Again, all added to this quick access entry point for creating measures. Okay, so with that, let's move back to the diagram. So you already saw how I would be creating hierarchies, relationships, either by using the create relationship dialog or by using drag and drop. Another thing I would like to show is now I've added a little bit more data in here. Right, so I've added more fields. So how do I find that particular profit calculation, for example? I know my logic behind it. It was in a specific location. But let's say I even inherit a model from somebody else. How do I go and find that? So one thing we wanted to do is enable this diagram for make it easier to work with larger models. I'm working with a relatively quite small model here, to be honest, so it doesn't have a whole lot of table. If I had 5 towns, let's say I had 100 tables in here, it becomes much harder to go and find your content. So what we added was a filtering tag system here, display tags, where I can say, do not show everything by default, but let's remove the columns, right? So now it's very easy for me to find the areas of where my different contexts exist, right? So here I haven't added any hierarchies yet, but you see the measures and you see the KPIs. It's very easy for me to find, right? Because I'm moving out here. So let's say I zoom in and say, here's my profit. Now I can simply right-click this one and say go to, and this go to will take me to that exact object over in the other view. So now I'm directly in the formula here, and I can go edit this one. Okay, so just a very quick way of filtering out your content as your model grows. But now talking about hierarchies, I haven't really created any of those yet, so that's another thing I would like to do. When I created my pivot table, you potentially saw that I went to two different tables. So I had both I actually had 3 tables, one for product category and subcategory, and I'd used just a single field from each of these. What I really would like to do, especially when optimizing for a higher number of users, first of all, I don't want 3 tables to show in here, so I want to collapse everything into one product table. But in addition to that, I want to not having to drag in 3 fields. I just want to click product and it show me this whole navigation path. Okay, so that's where the hierarchies come into place. What I have done, first of all, I want to take this field and add it to the product table. The way I've done that is to add them in here as calculated columns. So let me show you how I did that. So now go to again. You see these 2 columns are darker colored because they are calculated columns. So we make them more distinct by changing the color. So it's very easy for you to see which ones are calculated columns. So all I did here is I use the DAX syntax called related to travel the relationship and pull in the field. So all I have to do is really type related, go to the product category and select this column. Actually, I shouldn't do that, and say OK. So it pulls in the product category name from the product category table, traveling the relationship. So now I have these the same I did over here. Okay. So I can go back in here. What I can do now is hide these 2. I can't delete them because I'm traveling the relationship, so I need the data in here. But I can select them and I can hide from client tools. Hiding from client tools will, as the name indicates, hide them from the field list or any other client tool you're using, but it will still show it in here. And that's because if you're an Excel user, very often you want these to completely go away. If you're hiding something and it should go away. But if you're a professional building corporate BI models, typically you would actually like to still see them. So here we give you a cue that we indicate that they're hidden, but you can still see them. In addition, you can still work with this. This is still a fully functioning table, so I can build hierarchies and do formatting, do whatever in here, even if they're hidden. If I completely want to remove them, I can do that as well. I have a control up here called show hidden, and if I remove this one, they actually completely go away. Okay, I would like them in here because I would like to see what exists in my model. Excuse me. So with this, let's go ahead and create a hierarchy. I can either zoom in here and work with the model like this, it gets a little bit cluttered for me. So I would instead, I'll zoom out, and you have two small control here. So I will maximize my table. When I maximize my table, I am basically expanding it. This is now my modeling surface. You see how the background is dimmed out because the relationships pointing in here are no longer valid. This is now my modeling surface. So it's just to create focus on this work surface. So I'll select product name, and I'll go here and select product category and subcategory. All I have to do is say right click and say create hierarchy. And voila, it goes directly into rename state. I'll call this product and say OK. So that was my hierarchy. Now it happened to be that these came out perfectly in the right order. So I moved from category, subcategory, and product. We look at the cardinality between the rows in here. So that is why this happened to come out correctly. But if you're using other fields, that may not be. So for example, if I pick these, the order may seem pretty random. And what I can do is just call this model, for example, and I can manually adjust this as I see fit. So I can move things around using drag and drop. I can add more to it by just dropping either on top of the hierarchy, which would add it to the bottom, or I can put it exactly in the location where I want to add that field. Okay. You see that I have brackets, names, the names in bracket. These are the original source column names. I don't have to show them. I can show them. They only show obviously in the model environment, not in the client tools. The reason they're here is that if I rename this one, for example, I don't want it to be product name, just want it to be product. But if I go in here and say that I, for example, want to delete a field, I will actually be deleting it from if I delete a source column, I delete it from the hierarchy as well. So this is a good way for me to keep track that when I delete product name, I also delete the product from this hierarchy. So it's kind of convenient to have them shown there. Another thing you'll see, if you're working with a large table, let's say I want to add color somewhere. How do I do that now? I can't fiddle around with this scroll bar and there's not really enough room. So we've added a contextual tab here that will grow or expand as you build more hierarchies. So I can right click any field and say add to hierarchy. Now I have two hierarchies, so they show two hierarchies. So if I add this one to model, obviously every field can only exist one time in the same hierarchy. So since I added it once, now it's gone. I only have one remaining. Okay, so it's just another way of making it more convenient to work with larger models to get around with using your model. Another way to create a hierarchy is up here. I can say click to create hierarchy. When I use this entry point, we ignore your selection. When I use multi-select and use the right click, which is kind of a shorthand, we take all your selection into account and add all of the selected fields to your hierarchy. If you do not, if you select this guy up here, we ignore your context and we create basically an empty hierarchy. So I can call this one my test. Now, because I've added no columns, and this could be the first time I ever created a hierarchy, it says drag columns here to add levels, because you may not really know what to do with that. So if I add category in here, as soon as I add the first field, that helping text will actually go away, because now we assume that you know what to do. Okay, so it's only when the hierarchy is empty that we show that, and now you can build out your hierarchy that way. So now if I go back into, now there you see my hierarchy. So again, I can use the tag system here to easily find my different hierarchies. But if I now go and insert a pivot table, let's insert a new pivot table. I can add my sales amount. There you go. That was actually my KPI. Let me just deselect that one, add profit, and now I can go and find my product. You see I only have the product table, not the two other tables, and there are my different hierarchies. So there's my product hierarchy. Now with a single click, I add this whole navigation path. So again, Hierarchies is really for optimizing navigation path when your model is used by a larger number of users that use the same fields over and over again. And again, another reason that I added the fields in here from the two other tables is we only support hierarchies from fields coming from within the same table. So not only did it help me clean up the field list, but I actually have to do that to create hierarchies. Okay? So with that, let's move on to the last section I would like to talk about, which is an advanced tab. So I have the advanced tab enabled here. When you first enable PowerPivot, it will not be enabled. It's off by default, and it's out here in the file menu, switch to advanced mode. When I switch to advanced mode, I get a whole new tab. And the reason we did this was we actually wanted this feature set to be hard to find. It sounds strange, but we had a lot of discussions on which features do we add to PowerPivot versus which features do we want to add to the professional tool set, because some of the features definitely lends it better to a more experienced audience. What we did decide was we don't really want to force users to change tool to get to a specific feature. So we said instead we didn't want to intimidate novice users either who are just new to building these models, because essentially, think about it, when you just start out using PowerPivot, if you're not really used to building BI solutions, all you're doing is building analysis. So features like perspectives and default field settings and table behavior can be kind of intimidating, and you don't really need it on day one. But on the other hand side, if you are an experienced BI user, we didn't want to force you to have to install Visual Studio to get to use the tool. So we decided to hide it, and if you really need it, you will find them. So under the Advanced tab, it's a per user setting, so once you've set it for you on your machine, it will always show up in advanced mode. And Perspectives is a good example of this. So for those of you who are familiar with the OLAP cubes, you're probably familiar with perspectives. A perspective is essentially a view of the model. So we allow you to have one model, but build different views on top of it. So in a professional environment where you deploy your solution to the server, a user connecting to that model will have the option of either connecting to a perspective or connecting to the entire model. And once you've connected, you stay in that perspective, so there's no moving back and forth. Now that concept doesn't really work that way in PowerPivot because you're an admin here anyways. You can access everything. So in some ways, perspectives kind of doesn't really make sense, but they do anyway, because once you deploy or you upload this solution to SharePoint, if you're using PowerPivot for SharePoint, and you connect with a new Excel instance to an uploaded PowerPivot workbook, you get that server behavior. So you will now get the choice of either connecting to the entire model or to each of the perspectives. So in that perspective, the perspective really makes sense. So what we thought is, even if we want to enable that, is there any other ways we can leverage perspectives? And there actually is. So again, a concern we always had was, how do we enable users to work more efficiently with larger models? So this is another idea where we could use perspectives inside the design environment. So let me create some new perspectives and we'll take a look at that. So first, I have here both reseller sales and retail sales. So let me first do a retail perspective. Retail sales. Select the column. I can deselect the fields that I don't want to include. I can add a date, my products, and retail sales. Okay. Now I want more or less the same fields, but just for reseller. So I'll just create a copy. So we made it very easy to create similar perspectives with small deviation. So that was my next perspective. And let me just create a new one called customer, just because I want one with just one table in it. There you go. That was maybe 7 clicks to create 3 perspectives. So very, very seamless to do. I'll go ahead and click OK. Now, there's two ways you can now see these perspectives and use them. First of all, let's see how it will be for you when you consume the model. I can go out in Excel, and now you will see that I have a new drop down out here called perspective. Default perspectives means the entire model, but I can now say, oh, I actually never renamed that. This is actually, so here's my retail sales, which you see out here. So what you see here is I'm not impacting the pivot table. I'm not breaking anything, which really doesn't make sense. I have access to everything. This is just a way for me to filter out the field list to make it easier to work with. This is now my customer, which just has one table, and I have my what would be reseller sales out here, right? So it has my resellers and reseller sales. So again, just a way for you, since we have the perspective, to allow you to work with a more simplified field list. If I go back into the modeling environment, you'll see a perspective selection UI here. If you never have created any perspectives, you will not see this entire section of the UI. It won't be there. It won't be there until you enable perspectives and until you create your first perspective. So again, I can go into retail sales, and now you will see how my entire modeling surface changes. And we actually have individual layout, so you can lay out each of your perspectives differently. And now I just have these 6 tables to work with. What it also means that if I work for retail sales and I create a perspective in here for retail stores, that hierarchy, for example, will only show in this perspective and in the full model, obviously. So a very efficient way of working with a subset of your model. In addition, we also in the advanced tab has the default, what we call it, reporting properties. These are predominantly right now used for Crescent, but any third-party client tool can obviously leverage these. This is really how you, if you have seen presentations or worked with PowerView, you will see that a lot of the magic that empowers Crescent is actually enabled from within these properties. So, for example, what are the default labels? What are the default sets? For example, if you select a table, what are the default fields that you add or the end user add as they build the model? So again, I don't really have time to go through these, but these are very important valuable properties to get familiar with when you're using PowerView. So with that, I have one last thing that I actually forgot to talk about, which is multiple relationships. So let me just go back and pick the full model. What you see in here is I have some dotted lines. I have 3 relationships between, for example, date and retail sales. Okay, so what does this mean? In the first release of PowerPivot, we only allowed 1 relationship between a set of tables, and that is what corresponds to this guy, the full line. So we have 1 relationship with full line and 2 with dotted lines. The one with full line, the full line is what we call the active relationship. So we still allow only 1 active relationship per given set of tables, but we actually do import all of the relationships, but we just have them inactive. And I can change this. So in this scenario, if I highlight the active one, it's the order date key that is active. And I also have for due date and ship date. So in other words, if a user adds sales to a pivot table, now they add the date that the product was ordered. I have inactive relationship for when the payment is due and another one for when the product got shipped. Again, I can change these. This is just securing a default behavior for the customer. Obviously, you shouldn't change these around because your result set on your pivot table changed as well. But let's say I say it's really not, what was it, the order date? That is the one I want as my active relationship. So I can mark as inactive, and now you see that's dotted, and I can go and activate one of the other ones instead. So the idea here is, first of all, that we make it more apparent that you do have multiple relationships and that you probably need to take action, at least validate that we picked the right one. If not, go and make sure you have the right default relationship active. The other thing you can do is actually we allow you to use DAX calculations to travel inactive relationships. So let's say you want to enable end users to to get to both sales by order date and sales by due date. What you can do is either import the date table 2 times, which means you have 2 date tables, or you can say you can create 3 different measures, one of them traveling their separate relationships, and give the measure a name where that makes sense. So you can say order date whenever. So we have a specific DAX function called use relationship, which will allow you to define these 2 endpoints. So you don't have to import the table multiple times. Okay, with that was a large set of the features that we have added with this release of SQL Server 2012. There are more features, so let me just quickly go back into the deck. So this is the full feature overview. You'll have access to the deck. So I walked through most of these. I didn't walk through parent-child, which is available as well, which you can do using DAX calculation. So we don't have dedicated UI, but we do have DAX calculations. The other features mark as date table, which will allow you to basically mark an entire table as a date table, which means that when you're using filtering and sorting in Excel, you can leverage Excel's more advanced date filtering and sorting. And then we have the reporting properties that I didn't go through. And again, all of these features, despite the fact that I just showed PowerPivot, are also available inside Visual Studio with the SQL Server data tools. So again, I've shown you a lot of demos. Hopefully you are keen to go and try it out for yourself. I hope you will. So with that, I would like to thank you for your time and enjoy your modeling. Thank you.